getting over a cold, so I might not be able to project as loudly as I would like. So if you have a problem hearing what I say, just wave or throw something or ask me to speak louder like that. I wanted to present a little bit of some of the things that I've been doing for a book that is almost done and ready to send to the publisher. The book right now is titled Black Flags and Social Movements. This is the tentative cover, although strangely about a year ago Bloomsbury decided to drop all their political titles, so this book and the series that it's part of got moved to Manchester University Press. So otherwise it should be about the same. But I'm kind of in the middle of finishing my 11th of 12 chapters, so I feel a little bit like I'm meticulously studying the beauty of trees, and I may be kind of missing, the glory of the forest at the moment. So again, if there's a little bit too myopic here, just ask, and I'll try to back up for a second. So the main, I think, objective of the book is to try to position anarchist movements as an appropriate subject for social movement scholars. I think that maybe is a general goal of it. One of the things that I realized as I was studying social movements and reading about the literature, and even back in graduate school, that I realized that most of the movements that are typically discussed by fellow sociologists and political scientists tend to be reform-oriented movements. And I found a very consistent theme of kind of an avoidance of radical movements. And for a variety of reasons, I think that was the case. One, that social movement theory had a very difficult time envisioning why unsuccessful movements do what they do. Because with a few kind of exceptions of very revolutionary time periods, most movements that succeed are ones that are asking for very small demands, that are asking for the passage of a law or the reform of a law or a small change in some kind of policy, not the abolition of capitalism, not the abolition of the nation state, not the abolition of patriarchy or white supremacy and so forth. What I discovered was not only kind of an avoidance of it within the social movement literature, but of course anarchism itself has this very bad rap popularly, and so when I first learned about anarchism, I learned about it in the context that I think most people do as well, which, pick up a dictionary, you see that anarchism is essentially synonymous with chaos. Probably other kinds of things like these three sort of popular mythologies as identify them. Most references to anarchism have these central themes to them. First, chaos or disorder, that there's really no center for people to be involved in, no coordination or organization is possible. Second, that it must involve some kind of violence, a dog-eat-dog world, one in which there's the strongest person kind of is able to sort of rule. And even amongst people who say, well, it would be nice perhaps to not have a boss, but that's just sort of ridiculous. That's sort of naive and fantastical. That wouldn't be possible. And again, I think these ideas are circulated regularly throughout society. There's really no such thing as an anarchist society, although there are anarchist themes involved in our daily lives. So these things are propagated through socialization systems, and they're of course present in other sorts of social control systems too. And I saw a very regular manifestation in social movement literature too. Typically when sociologists talk about anarchism, it's often in these kind of caricature terms as well, although there's kind of been a resurgence in talking about anarchist themes, as well as anarchist movements in some kind of peripheral way in sociology for the past, I'd say 10, 15 possibly years or so. And I think like a lot of other successful movements, I think we can go back to say the 1960s, that the incorporation of anarchist themes may be running in tandem with the possible success or the favorability of anarchist movements, in the same way that strong themes and an emphasis on issues of race and gender emerged when social movements pushed for that in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. So I think, again, movements are perhaps driving some of the interest amongst academics and intellectuals on these issues. I did a few database searches and found zero mentions of anarchism or anarchist movements within the sort of premier social movement journal, Mobilization. I didn't look at Sociology Compass. One exception, Mobilization, was a study that dealt with sort of an anarchist tactic called the Black Bloc, written by actually an anarchist sociologist named Leslie Wood. There are a few studies in the Social Movement Studies Journal, which is a little bit more European focused and has a little bit of a different framing of social movement theory than we do in North America. But again, you could probably count that on your hand. Well, 6, I guess. So for my study, and again, please tell me when I'm getting close to the time, I first wanted to think about are anarchist movements really social movements? So what would make them sort of qualify as a social movement that would be sort of legitimate for us to study, and do they have sort of the characteristics that we're interested in? Secondly, who are anarchists? And perhaps almost as interesting, where do anarchists tend to be? And how would we actually locate them if that were possible? And again, I'm not going to talk about this third question right here, but it's part of the book that I'm writing. What theories may be the best and most able to explain these kinds of movements? Again, if they are movements. Again, given the fact that most social movement theories do seem to be most successful in explaining reform-oriented movements. And then lastly, I'm very interested in how, even though, as I'm going to show you, anarchists do exist, they probably do qualify as a movement, they are a relatively small portion of active social movements in the world. And I think you're right, I think Chris is right, that they're a very small relative portion of the global left. That said, I think it's important to think about how they work with and sometimes against other comparable movements that may have more reform-oriented focuses or maybe more narrow focus in terms of their issues and objectives. To maybe contextualize them for a moment, and I think Chris did a good job with it, but just to kind of give another kind of viewpoint on it. From a 20th century standpoint, this was typically how people viewed anarchists in relation to other sorts of big ideological trends in the 20th century. They are very strongly on the left, but they're also very strongly on the autonomist or anti-state movement. So they very much want autonomy or freedom from the state or kind of an anti-authoritarian perspective, at the same time that they envision social justice, social equality as being very important. And this is one of the reasons why, at least outside of the United States, that libertarianism or libertarian socialism or libertarian communism is generally synonymous with anarchism. And libertarianism, at least here in that American context, has really only been itself a 20th century phenomenon. And kind of the active right, radical right, has sort of been able to appropriate that term, I think, rather successfully. So for me, I was very interested in how I would define anarchists, because this is a very central debate if you go in and interview anarchists, that it's very important to think about what makes one an anarchist. And so I thought, well, this is actually a trickier question than one might imagine, because lots of people are called anarchists when they're not anarchists. Many people may claim the title where there may be very little evidence of it. Again, I think for a few reasons, but one of the main reasons is because people don't simply understand the term very well. Someone who kind of thinks that they don't want to listen to anybody else might call himself an anarchist without realizing that there's a fairly long 150-year tradition of people acting as anarchists that's really got nothing to do with it. So with this typology, what I'm trying to do is contrast people who claim an anarchist identity, the label of anarchism, and contrast it with their actual positions. Whether it's them having certain values, whether them operating within or creating certain anarchist-like structures, or involving themselves in anarchist behaviors or actions. And there's a certain very obvious group of people who identify as anarchists who seem to be acting in anarchist fashions. There's one group that I think that I'm trying to exclude and that I don't work too much with that do claim an anarchist identity, but for whatever reason operate in organizations that have very strong leadership. They advocate perhaps voting. This is one way of kind of excluding Libertarian Party advocates. It does include some people who identify as anarcho-capitalists, which I think the people who identify as explicitly anarchist find very much an oxymoronic term, because they consider capitalism to be very much fundamentally a hierarchical structure, and if you're sort of opposed to, there's perhaps more advocacy of hierarchy, I think, in anarcho-capitalism for these folks, so they kind of reject the anarcho-capitalists as part of their tribe. There's another kind of new emergence that's kind of in North America, but also in Eastern Europe, called national anarchists, who anarchists seem to be interpreting as sort of a third positionist, fascist incursion into anarchist movements to try to push anarchists in more of a nationalist or potentially fascist direction. But again, I think most anarchists, especially in this category, reject that again because of the prioritization of nationhood, citizenship status, and also kind of the whiteness too. I do focus a little bit in the book on implicitly anarchist people who don't use the label anarchist, but for whatever reason are operating sort of as if they are anarchists. They have comparable values. They typically involve themselves in horizontalist, anti-authoritarian organizations, and they do direct action and mutual aid, all the sorts of things that anarchists do. But again, they don't necessarily adopt the title. And then there's a whole nother, the vast majority of people here that are throughout most movements and of course general society who don't adopt the label and don't have, don't kind of participate in those kinds of things anyways. So I thought that if we were to think about what a social movement is, we should try to think if anarchism has those kind of elements of a social movement. And I'm particularly fond of Mario Diani's definition of a social movement that says that it's a network of individuals, of organizations that have a collective identity, that engage in extra-institutional collective action together. And so if that's the case, then we should be able to find individuals, organizations who have these identities, who do these things together, and are involved in some kind of perhaps tenuous network with each other. So this is a horribly confusing, but hopefully pretty, because of the colors, chart that shows some of the different ways in which there's diverse amounts of participation across, and again I'm kind of constricting it here to a certain 2-decade time period in North America, that we can see different kinds of organizational structures that people have chosen, as well as a number of different kind of overlapping, maybe anarchistic, but also non-anarchist movements and organizations that have participated with, have collaborated with, have sometimes provided solidarity and support to, and sometimes overlapping, sometimes borrowing. And I can talk a little bit more about this if people want, but I don't want to spend too much time on it, except to say that I think that there is enough happening here that it probably constitutes something that we would qualify as a network, and thus, in this case, a social movement. What may be most interesting to some people is a little bit of the second question, which is, who do anarchists tend to be? What are some of their background characteristics? And I think in this place, this overlaps quite a bit with Chris's research. I didn't do any surveys, but I'm actually able to use a number of surveys. I decided that, given kind of the misconceptions about anarchists and who they are, that it may be difficult to use non-anarchist data sources. So in fact, my book relies a lot on anarchist data to do this. And anarchists, and maybe sort of seem like a misnomer for people who again think anarchists are all about chaos and disorder, but they're incredibly organized in many ways.
And they sociologists. So
what's that?
Some of them are sociologists.
Some of them are sociologists, as it turns out. And some of them are educated, although not all of them are super highly educated. But there is a certain sense of order and structure, and they've done a number of self-studies, you might even call it, which is interesting, but I'll get to that in a minute. I thought that maybe one of the most interesting ways to kind of talk to people about this was I wanted to contrast how other people see anarchists and how they've characterized their characteristics in contrast to how we would anarchists actually, what the characteristics that anarchists actually have. So this is 2 slides from a PowerPoint presentation that the FBI gave not quite 10 years ago, but it was very interesting when I first saw it. I was looking at some of the documents from it, and they were characterizing, it was kind of all about anarchist extremism, which I thought was very interesting. And they had these 2 slides which were contrasting the previous waves, and we can maybe think about these as waves of movements, that the previous sort of current, the previous early wave of anarchism, which we may call the golden age of anarchism around the turn of the late 1800s, early 1900s, to kind of the current wave of time that's probably existed since the fall of the Berlin Wall, kind of the rejuvenation of anarchists since then. And very interestingly, what I found was that it seems like the FBI really actually liked the old anarchist movement quite a bit, which was very interesting, of course, considering all the kind of efforts of the pre-FBI national law enforcement to destroy anarchism at that time. Notably, of course, J. Edgar Hoover kind of personally overseeing the deportation of the United States' most famous anarchist, Emma Goldman. But notice how they say highly dedicated to specific cause and ideology, not dedicated to a particular cause. So I look at surveys to find, well, there's lots of causes and advocacy that are involved in. Individuals turning to criminal activity out of frustration, or criminals seeking an ideology to justify their activities. Fairly well organized and proactive versus generally unorganized and reactive. Made up of educated individuals from various backgrounds, often students. Made up of younger, educated, middle to upper class individuals. So again, maybe using the same kind of, the attempt to kind of negatively caricature current anarchists that I think were used quite regularly in the past. What I did was I looked at a couple different surveys. One was a user survey from a very popular anarchist website called infoshop.org. They conducted a survey of their users in 2002, which was a few years after the kind of the rise of the global justice movement and a lot of kind of active protests throughout the world at economic summits, including the World Economic Forum, that had strong anarchist themes to them, including direct action and property destruction, trying to shut down these meetings to prevent delegates from attending. So the infoshop.org website collected almost 1,000 respondents to their survey, and I found all sorts of interesting things. I wanted to kind of also think about if that FBI claim was true, that how would we contrast that earlier wave, which was very much embedded in the radical militant labor movement at the time, contrast today? Is it sort of the fact that people have kind of lost their class analysis within anarchist movements? So I was able to contrast union to non-union members. I show you t-test results, even though I say that with a twinkle in my eye that perhaps this is even less representative than I think your survey probably. You hope it was. This is clearly
how many people? 1,000?
964. But it's from a website, so we're talking about a pure convenience sample.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the FBI could have been going on there and submitting that to us.
Could be a
But
reason.
presumably, I don't know why they would waste their time. But again, so take everything with a grain of salt. There are some significant differences. Notice that union member anarchists are definitely more able to identify or more interested in identifying with the working class. They tend to be older. They are also more likely not to be North American. So again, we see very strong tendencies of anarcho-syndicalism, which is sort of a strain of radical unionism in Europe, more prominently, as well as Latin America, much more than in North America. I also use a little bit of data from the 2010 so-called anarchist survey, which people call the Big Anarchist Survey. And that had well over 2,500 respondents to it. And they asked even more questions than the infoshop.org survey did. They found a number of very prominent trends, some of which I think are reinforced from Chris's study. One of the interesting things that they found was that some 80% of their respondents were male-identified individuals. So if that's true, we're talking about a movement that is strongly male, at least in terms of its self-identified members, or at least maybe the ones who are using the internet. There is also a very strong, I think, kind of rejection of the FBI's claim that we're talking about upper middle class or upper class individuals. Approximately a third of all the respondents to the Big Anarchist Survey identified as working class or poor, and a very small number of them identified as upper middle class or upper class. So not to say that they're not a highly educated group within there, but again, it's not as perhaps elite, sort of privileged and sort of whining about the world as the FBI is claiming. And part of that is a theme that the media was running at this time, that these are sort of college students that were sort of spoiled rich kids that sort of were angry that their dad doesn't, buy them a Lexus, so they're going to protest against capitalism or something like that. That apparently is not the case. So again, I'm sorry for glossing over a lot of it, but I wanted to get to the second part of that question. If we know a little bit about who they are, where are they, and what kinds of, where can we find them, and what kind of manifestations do we find this anarchist presence? There's a great directory that I think helps a little bit with this, called the Anarchist Yellow Pages. Maybe a pun on the more popular directory that's quickly becoming obsolete thanks to smartphones, where they tried to collect all mentions of anarchist organizations throughout the world. This is from their directory from 2005, a decade ago. They found over, I should get this number correct, 2,171 anarchist organizations throughout the world. Every continent in the world, with the exception of Antarctica, of course. Although that doesn't mean there's not anarchists maybe doing, soil samples in the ice or something. But I mean, they don't have an organization on this. I wanted to look a little bit about how these organizations were different from each other. So I grouped together the classifications that the Anarchist Yellow Pages use. There's a very strong class orientation in many of these organizations. Perhaps the largest one, however, was the emphasis on creating local physical spaces for people to congregate, to have meetings, to have events, to share ideas, to organize campaigns. There's also very much a strong propagandistic element to anarchist movements. This includes newspapers, magazines. This is in a time where there's still radio programs and cable access TV shows that are happening that are listed here as well, book publishers and so forth. When we actually kind of look throughout the world in different places, we see a wide variety of different kinds of concentrations of these organizations. The autonomists that Chris was mentioning right here, very strongly based in Italy, throughout Germany, and kind of this part of Central Europe right here. They have lots of what are known as these physical spaces called the social centers, or centri sociali, which were kind of these squatted buildings that were vacant, that local movements got together to kind of occupy, to have alternative cultural events and other kind of radical things there, including to run campaigns from. This is kind of the origin of the Disobediti, or the white overall movement, the Wombles and so forth. People that put on huge padding and protests and kind of link arms and run into police lines and so forth to kind of drive through them. You can see other kinds of concentrations, including through France and Spain right here, of syndicalist organizations. Some of the strongest syndicalist unions in the world are found in Spain and France. And so I think there's some very strong and interesting patterns that we find when we look at this, and we can see maybe different trends throughout different anarchist movements across national boundaries. I made one final map just for your benefit, because I have a background in geography, and I think maps are pretty cool, even though this map's kind of, it's not awesome anymore. To look at kind of the concentrations across the world. Here I'm looking not only at the 2005 Anarchist Yellow Pages, but one from almost a decade prior, as well as one that dates back to the early 1980s. There was an effort actually out of some people from the Bay Area to create what was called the International Blacklist, which was a huge booklet that detailed all these organizations in a pre-internet period. And it's a very phenomenal list and kind of a wonderful record of anarchist movements at that time. Of course, we can see heavy concentrations in North America and Europe, excuse me, but a pretty strong representation also in much of Latin America. Not much going on in Africa. However, and you were saying Nairobi, nothing in Kenya, although there's a little bit of underrepresentation here. And I think part of the issue with using this kind of data is that there may be overrepresentation in places that have stronger civil society protections for different kinds of civil liberties. Because I know, because I've done some research into it, that there are a number of active anarchist organizations throughout Africa, including sub-Saharan Africa, but they don't tend to get listed in these directories. In fact, they very consciously tell other people who want to write them, for instance. There's one that's a little bit gray right here in Nigeria. There's a group called the Awareness League that had hundreds of members who were part of the student movement in the 80s and 90s that opposed the Nigerian dictatorship. And they would actively write on their literature, if you're going to send us a message, don't write anything political on the envelope, because it's going to get seized by the National Post Office and so forth. There was an organization in Zimbabwe called the Koyi Arts Collective, which kind of couched as anarchist politics in an art that they did with community groups and so forth. So there's probably an effort from some anarchists to sort of fly underneath the radar. So if anything, this is probably an undercounting as opposed to an overcounting of
Can you
organizations.
talk about the Middle East and North Africa a little? Do you have any?
Yeah, the only ones we really find are there are a few in Israel and Turkey. Turkey has quite a few anarchist organizations, and part of that is that Turkey, at least up until the very recent period, has had a fairly high tolerance for the left and has a good amount of secularism, which has sort of tolerated anarchist movements. Although anarchists probably in the 1990s kind of had their hardest go at it because of their advocacy of the Kurds. So there was a lot of kind of attack that they got from sort of the Turkish national government. But, there are undoubtedly anarchist groups throughout all of here today, especially since the Arab Spring kind of brought to the forefront. But again, they didn't appear in these documents or directories, so I don't list them. But undoubtedly, they're in most countries throughout the world. So I tried making a little bit of an effort to see whether or not there was much carryover, and this is kind of a term that I just used out of convenience, between these different time periods that these directories were documenting. So, because anarchists, again, if some of our ideas about anarchists is that they're sort of unstable, or there's kind of chaos involved in them, how permanent are these movements? Do the organizations that they create, do they last very long, or sort of are they over as quick as people's fascination lasts for? And I actually found very little carryover from these different time periods. So were organizations mentioned in 1983 that were also around in 1997? If they were mentioned in 1997, were they mentioned later on in 2005? There was a very small number of them. In fact, if you add them all up here, we're only talking about a few dozen organizations out of literally thousands upon thousands that actually were around later. I think this may be somewhat misleading. It just means that that exact organization isn't around. There could have been a permutation of that movement that lasted. But also, I think what might be more likely, because if you look at the actual cities or countries that they're in, and this chart unfortunately doesn't show it, they tend to be in the same places. Okay? So the anarchist organization, the density of them tend to be in the same countries and the same cities repetitively, even if the same organization isn't there. So there's some kind of general milieu that tends to support apparently anarchist organizations. Bigger cities are one of those things that support it. So most major cities in Europe had dozens of anarchist organizations as of 2005. Rome had the largest number, somewhat like 60 organizations, anarchist organizations. But that said, I do want to kind of emphasize that there was very little of this kind of consistency across time. But that might be a fair question to ask of other movements too. How much consistency is there
Right.
across time? I mean, AIM is around, but again, AIM has even changed too. Like, I mean, now there's like the Central Governing Council in Minneapolis, and there's sort of these autonomous ones, you know. And so, I mean, can we kind of count that as the same thing, or is it sort of a modification or an evolution, or just maybe like one chart? Sure. So maybe just one chart that I showed a little bit. I tried to deal with a little bit of social movement theory. Political opportunity theory is one of those very popular theories, the kind of part of the political process theory that a lot of big social movement scholars have worked with, like McAdam and Tildy. And I thought political opportunity theory was fairly problematic for anarchist movements, particularly the idea that anarchists would use the state to accomplish state-based goals. I mean, would anarchists sort of mobilize favorable elites in the government to say pass an abolish the state bill or something like that? I mean, is that a conceivable thing to entertain? That said, I think that
Abolish the state bill.
In California.
how many approach do we get?
Actually, the John Burgers in Orange County want to do that.
Yeah, and so there is kind of a libertarian element to some of that kind of want to reduce government, but again, I mean, it doesn't kind of fit with the idea of abolishing capitalism, abolishing the state, and so forth. That said, I don't think the structure of opportunity theory itself is bad. I think that all movements are using opportunity to some way or another. And I thought maybe what I should do instead is, as opposed to saying sort of very clearly operationalized goals or successes, which again these movements maybe don't have in terms of their broad goals, like the success of the overthrow of a government or something like that. Can we see evidence of decline or mobilization of these movements? And so to do this, what I did was I looked at a number of different anarchist narratives written by anarchists as they're identifying and characterizing their own movements. So again, anarchists are very interested in their own history, and so I used the A-infos, which I don't know if anyone's ever seen this. This is, again, one of those interesting examples of a movement creating its own resources. So this has been around since the 1990s. You can find it online. It's ainfos.ca because it's hosted in Canada. It's essentially a newswire service by anarchists and for anarchists. So they circulate information, news about their campaigns and organizations and so forth and their ideas throughout the world. It's available in some dozen languages, hundreds of postings every week that come around. I utilize this as a source to look for anarchist histories based in different countries. So I picked 6 of them right here: Bolivia, the UK, Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia during some of this period, Greece, Japan, and Venezuela. And I looked through those histories, those stories told by these movement scholars about the history of their own movement in their country. And I found a number of different themes that explained some things that made it easy for those movements to mobilize, but also led to, in some other moments, decline. And there are a number of different things that were interesting. I don't know if I should spend much time talking about some of those, but interestingly, there were some contrasts. Some movement scholars interpreted some things contradictorily depending on the country, including, and maybe most notably right here, the rise of Bolshevism. So kind of in the early 1900s, the rise of this alternative left, and kind of its success embodied in the Bolshevik movement in Russia. In some places was actually interpreted as a success, that it drove a wedge and it kind of marginalized people that were more followers of Trotsky or Lenin at the time, but didn't do very good in other countries. Same thing for state repression. In some places they interpreted the repression of the state killing their movements. In other places they viewed it as something that reinvigorated them and allowed them to sort of fight back. It gave them momentum, such in the case of Greece and Czechoslovakia. So a little bit more of the book, for the last few chapters or so, I deal with the ways in which anarchism relates to other movements, particularly how maybe amongst the anarchistic or the implicitly anarchist world, other organizations have adopted anarchist strategies or structures. Organizations like Anti-Racist Action, Critical Mass, Earth First, Food Not Bombs, these kind of what I call anarchistic franchise organizations that kind of pop up all over the place. Also looking at the ways in which anarchists work with non-anarchists, such as including liberals, other left-leaning or radical individuals like Marxist-Leninists, and a final chapter that deals with the transition of non-anarchists to anarchists. And so in that chapter I focus on the transition of a number of Marxist-Leninist black liberationist activists in the United States who transitioned throughout the 1960s and 70s to identify as black anarchists by the 1980s. Individuals like Lorenzo Kumbuya Irvin, Kouassi Balagoon, Martin Sostre, and a few other individuals too. So I kind of look at the personal transformation they make from non-anarchists to anarchists. And for them, a lot of it is their experience in the Black Panther Party, particularly feeling emboldened by the community activism of the party, but also feeling very disaffected by what they viewed as the authoritarian leadership structure of much of the party's control, especially in the later years of the party. So anyways, that's a little bit of my overview of the book. Again, I'm sorry about my congestion. I hope you could understand what I was saying. Thanks for listening.